Chapter 5, Predicting the Future. But as for certain truth, no man has known it, nor will he know it, neither of the gods, nor yet of all the things of which I speak. And even if by chance he were to utter the final truth, he would himself not know it, for all is but a woven web of guesses. Ex-Sonophanes. We can only measure the past abnormal earnings of a firm from a firm's financial statements. We saw in Chapter 2 that the past is a trip already taken by equity investors. The value of a firm is its value today, which is related to the trip the firm is expected to take in the future. We need to ask, what do we expect a firm's economic profit or cash flow will be in the future? The answer is, no one knows for sure. Some argue it is too difficult to predict a firm's future economic profit or cash flow. In other words, that it is not practical to understand a firm's value by really engaging with a firm's economic and business realities. Rather, some would argue it is much better to attempt to predict the price someone else might be prepared to pay for an equity interest today or in the future. Such an attitude can easily lead us to rely on comparables, or perhaps on the market value of various assets of a firm. These approaches do not involve connecting to what a firm is doing to add value to equity investors, nor for that matter to add value to debt investors, employees, customers, suppliers, the general community, or the environment. However, with skill and effort, we can estimate a firm's future economic profit or cash flow with perhaps greater insight than others. Forecasting a firm's equity economic profit requires us to forecast three things: return on equity, ROE, the required rate of return on equity, ROE, and the book value of ordinary shareholders' equity, BV. Forecasting a firm's enterprise economic profit requires us to forecast three similar but slightly different things: return on net operating assets, RNOA, the required rate of return on a firm's operations, WACC, and the book value of net operating assets, NOA. And forecasting a firm's cash flow requires us to forecast a firm's free cash flow, which can be expressed as operating income, OI, minus delta NOA, change in net operating assets, and requires us to forecast operating income and net operating assets, and the required rate of return on a firm's operations, weighted average cost of capital, WACC. When we remember return on net operating assets equals operating income divided by net operating assets, we can see that forecasting a firm's cash flow requires us to make the same forecasts as we need to make to forecast a firm's enterprise economic profit. We will see in this chapter that to forecast a firm's enterprise economic profit or cash flow, we will need to forecast profit margins, PM, which is operating income divided by sales, asset turnover, ATO, which is sales divided by net operating assets, and sales growth. The difference between forecasting a firm's equity economic profit and its enterprise economic profit is that to forecast a firm's equity economic profit, we also need to forecast its net financial obligations, or in other words, its level of gearing or borrowings. When forecasting a firm's enterprise economic profit or cash flow, we do not need to do this. We will now use the term economic profit to refer to enterprise economic profit. In this chapter, we will look at forecasting two of the three drivers of economic profit or cash flow: return on net operating assets and net operating assets. Return on net operating assets is the operating income after tax that is being generated by a firm's operating income. Return on net operating assets is the operating income after tax that is being generated by a firm's operating activities. All other things being equal, the greater the return on net operating assets, the more will be a firm's economic profit. And if return on net operating assets exceeds a firm's weighted average cost of capital, the greater the net operating assets, the more will be a firm's economic profit. The issues with estimating and forecasting the required rate of return on operations, weighted average cost of capital, will be dealt with in Chapter 7. We need to forecast return on net operating assets and net operating assets intelligently and sensibly, and with a degree of confidence so that we would be prepared to rely on our forecasts as a basis for making investment decisions. To do this, we need to understand the drivers of return on net operating assets and net operating assets in the past, and then to forecast these drivers, how they might change in the future. The accounting drivers, merely passengers on the journey of the firm, are not the actual drivers of a firm's return on net operating assets and net operating assets. The actual drivers of a firm's return on net operating assets and net operating assets are the specific economic and business drivers of a firm's activities. It is these realities we want to better understand so we can better predict how these might change in the future. 5.1. Forecasting return on net operating assets. To forecast return on net operating assets, RNOA, we first need to forecast the economic and business drivers of a firm's return on net operating assets. We then need to estimate the effect of these future economic and business drivers of a firm on its future accounting drivers of return on net operating assets and on its future return on net operating assets itself. In this way, we can turn a forecast of the economic and business drivers into a forecast of its return on net operating assets. To analyse a firm's return on net operating assets, we need to be able to intelligently engage with a firm's restated financial statements. Figure 4.2, included in Chapter 4, Section 4.3, describes the three aspects to an analysis of return on equity: leverage, profitability, and efficiency. As we will be focusing on analysing return on net operating assets rather than return on equity, we will only look at analysing two of these aspects: profitability and efficiency. We will not be forecasting a firm's leverage. As we break a firm's financial statements into bits, we can increase our understanding of the aspects of a firm's financial statements which are influencing or leading to the headline figure of return on net operating assets. By combining these insights from the financial statements with other sources of information on the economy, industry, and the firm, we can form judgments about how to connect the accounting drivers of return on net operating assets with specific elements of the economic and business realities of a firm. It is these economic and business realities that are the real drivers of return on net operating assets. The accounting numbers, including the specific accounting drivers, are simply passengers on the journey of a firm. The accounts are passengers. We use financial statement analysis to help us know what adds value to a business. A key concept to remember is that the financial statements are not the economic and business realities of a firm. Rather, they are the financial statements. We need to understand specific key elements of the financial statements as part of our analysis of the financial statements. But we need to do much more. We need to engage with the economic and business drivers of a firm. As any teenager knows, there is all the difference in the world between being a passenger in a car, which we could have been doing all our lives, perhaps having started out being strapped into a baby capsule, and first hopping behind the wheel and being a driver. All the difference in the world. The financial statements are passengers, not drivers, in the real world of business. They are going along for the ride, but to understand the ride and where it is going, we need to focus on the economic and business drivers of a firm, using the financial statements and other information to help us do this. Restating financial statements and breaking the financial statements into bits to identify accounting drivers involves mainly technical skills that can be learned largely from reading books such as this study guide, watching videos and attending classes, and reinforced with practice. However, the connection of the accounting drivers of return on net operating assets with the economic and business realities driving these accounting drivers of return on net operating assets requires skills and insights which can only be developed with real understanding, experience and application. This is not a mechanical, turn the handle, no need to think process. It is quite the opposite. It requires real skill and insight, and in this there is a potential advantage for us. Most people we know will get jobs, earn money, learn how to drive, own a car or a house, get married or live with someone, operate a bank account, use ATMs, surf the net, and so on and on. There are many things in life that most people we know seem to master and be able to do quite well. But there are other things in life that not many people we know may be able to do well. For example, most people seem able to get married or live with someone, but much fewer are able to stay married or live with someone for life, and far, far fewer are able to stay married or live with someone for life in a fulfilling, developing and rich relationship. Not many are able to do this. The reason for this is that it is far easier to get married or decide to live with someone than it is to maintain a strong, positive relationship for 50 years. It is far easier to do some things in life than it is to do some other things. The point is this: we can tell which things are easier to do and which are harder to do by seeing how successful most people are at different things. If most people can do something quite well or adequately, then it is probably quite straightforward to do. If very few can do something well, then it is probably not so easy. It would be sensible for us to focus our attention and energy on those things that are harder to do. We can simply master the easier things along the way as we go. If I walk down Swanston Street in Melbourne, I could probably find many people who are able to flick through a firm's financial statements and look at the pictures and some of the headline comments and say something about what a firm does. However, many of these same people might feel intimidated by the raft of numbers and footnotes in a firm's financial statements. If I asked people who had studied accounting and finance at Monash University in Melbourne, I might find many of them are able to analyse a firm's financial statements by calculating a few ratios of various types. Yet if I walked up St George's Terrace in Perth, or King William Street in Adelaide, or Queen Street Mall in Brisbane, or asked graduates of business schools from the University of New South Wales in Sydney through to the University of Auckland in New Zealand, I would likely find very few people able to make meaningful assessments about a firm based on its financial statements. Very few. The reason for this is that few people can intelligently connect a firm's financial statements to its economic and business realities. Even fewer would be able to sensibly and intelligently forecast these economic and business realities of a firm and then connect them to forecasts of a firm's key accounting drivers and to its value. This is what this chapter is about. It is a journey into an area that is hard to do in practice. But just as you do not need to be particularly intelligent, good-looking, wealthy, or have a first-class honours degree in psychology to have a successful marriage, so you do not need to be particularly intelligent, good-looking, wealthy, or be some sort of financial guru to be successful in analysing financial statements. Just as anyone can potentially have a successful marriage, so anyone also can potentially be successful and capable in analysing financial statements. A key to having a successful marriage is to give the relationship a priority in amongst all the other things we could be doing, to focus on the relationship with the other person. A key to being able to analyse and use financial statements and to know what adds value to a firm is to focus on the relationship between the likely future economic and business drivers of a firm and the firm's key accounting drivers. Anyone can learn these skills, but few do. In this chapter, we are at the heart of financial statement analysis. It also happens to be the bit that is the most difficult to do. I know it is the most difficult because very few people can do it well. Indeed, many do not even try to engage with a firm's economic and business realities. Yet here lies the opportunity. Equity investing is a relative game, a game of buying and selling equity investments in firms with other equity investors. To be successful at this game, all you must do is be better than average at assessing the value of firms. You only need to be better than average to be successful. This is not something like getting a driver's license or opening a bank account, which most people we know in life seem able to master. No, this is one of those things that few seem able to do particularly well. How to predict the future. To be good at financial statement analysis, we'll need to be good at nothing less than predicting the uncertain future better than some others, better than average. Economic and business drivers. As we have discussed previously, to the extent we are looking at the past, our efforts are of little direct relevance to understanding the value of a firm. Rather, we need to engage with and make judgments about how the economic and business drivers of a firm's return on net operating assets, RNOA, and net operating assets, NOA, could be expected to change in the future. And we need to be able to convert these judgments into numbers, into the future accounting drivers of return on net operating assets and net operating assets, and form a credible, convincing and intelligent forecast of return on net operating assets and net operating assets. This process may be many things, but it is not technical or mechanistic. It is an art form, not a science. It is more like playing a bass guitar in a rock band than seeking to find a phone number in our phone's contact list. More like paragliding off Coronet Peak near Queenstown in the South Island of New Zealand from a 1,200 metre high takeoff point than staying home and watching a travel show on TV. It is in our assessments about the future that we can arrive at views of value and be able to make money. The game of investing and of financial statement analysis is a game played out by imaginings of the future. Remember, we are interested in the trip we might take with a firm in the future as an equity investor, not with the past, which is a trip that has already been taken by others. We will first consider the issues of forecasting the economic and business drivers of a firm's return on net operating assets, RNOA. We will then consider the issues of identifying the accounting drivers and then identifying and forecasting the economic and business drivers of a firm's net operating assets, NOA. In Chapter 4, we identified the following key economic and business drivers of Ryman Healthcare's profit margins, PM, and of its return on net operating assets. Strong development margins and growth in residential property values. Strong demand for retirement village units. This is due to about 3% per year population growth in the 75 plus age group in New Zealand and Australia, and a growing proportion of people in the 75 plus age group in New Zealand and Australia who wish to live in retirement villages. Ryman Healthcare's significant capacity to develop, own and manage retirement villages. Rate of turnover of occupation rights to Ryman Healthcare's existing retirement village units of about 7 years, which now may be slightly more than 7 years. High occupancy levels of Ryman Healthcare's retirement village units, serviced apartments, rest homes and hospitals. We need to ask ourselves, how do we expect these drivers to change in the future? And the current coronavirus pandemic has increased the current level of uncertainty. For example, residential property values in New Zealand and Australia had a period of increasing strongly, then for a few years have fallen in some cities such as Melbourne and Auckland, before growing strongly across Australia and New Zealand in 2020 and 2021. What do we expect to happen with residential property values in the future? There has been strong growth in demand for retirement villages in recent years in New Zealand and Australia, driven by a growing population of people over 75 years old in New Zealand and Australia, and more critically, an increasing proportion of those over 75 years of age wishing to live in retirement villages. Do we expect this to continue or to change? Based on an assessment of a range of information, including economic forecasts and potentially a wide range of soft information from various sources, we could form a judgment with varying degrees of confidence about how we think these key economic and business drivers of Ryman Healthcare might change in the future. We might form a view about some of the key economic and business drivers of Ryman Healthcare's return on net operating assets as follows. Reduced levels of expected future growth in residential property values. For example, we might forecast growth in residential property values and in future revaluations of Ryman Healthcare's properties as set out in Table 5.1 below. Table 5.1, Growth in Residential Property Values. 2022, 15%, 2023, 10%, 2024, 0%, 2025, 2.5%, 2026, 5%. Note, years ending 31 March. These forecast growth rates are much less than in recent years. For example, in New Zealand, national house prices rose by about 20% in the year ending 31 March 2021, after growth of about 7.5% 2020, 2% 2019, 3% 2018, 6% 2017, 14% 2016 and 11% 2015. And in Australia, national house prices rose by about 15% in the year ending 31st March 2021, after rising by about 6% in 2020, falling by about 5% in 2019, and falling by about 3% in 2018, and after growth of about 5% 2017, 10% 2016, and 9% 2015. These forecast growth rates reflect our view that we expect 15% growth in house prices in the years ending 31 March 2022 and 10% growth in 2023 and zero growth in 2024, and for growth to slowly increase again. Note also that the growth in residential property values will not only influence Ryman Healthcare's future operating income through the level of its property revaluations. The growth in residential property values will also influence the price at which Ryman Healthcare can sell and resell its occupation rights, and will affect its profit margin on these sales and resales. Also, the price at which Ryman Healthcare can sell and resell its occupation rights will influence its level of management fees, which are calculated as a percentage of the selling price of occupation rights. Another aspect of residential property values is that we can expect them to change in significantly different ways in different cities and regional areas in New Zealand and Australia. For example, Ryman Healthcare in Australia only operates in the Greater Melbourne area, so we should focus on future house prices in the Melbourne area. We could also decide to focus residential property values for different cities and regions in New Zealand and apply these to Ryman Healthcare's properties in these different cities and regions. However, to be able to do this, we would need to make some assumptions about the proportion of the value of Ryman Healthcare's properties that are in different cities and regions in New Zealand, as Ryman Healthcare does not disclose such a breakdown of its property values. Whether this level of detail in our analysis was valuable or worth the extra effort would depend on whether it provided sufficiently more useful forecasts for Ryman Healthcare's abnormal earnings to justify the extra effort. In any analysis of a firm, there will always be a pragmatic question of considering the costs and benefits of applying extra or less effort in various aspects of an analysis. It will always be a pragmatic question of focusing our efforts and energies on understanding those aspects of the economic and business realities of a firm that will give us the more useful insights into the value of a firm. Continued strong sales growth. For example, we might forecast growth rates for each source of Ryman Healthcare's sales or operating revenues for the next 5 years, 2022 to 2026, as set out in Table 5.2 below. Table 5.2, Ryman Healthcare's sales forecast assumptions, 2022 to 2026. Care fees increase by 15% each year. Sales of new occupation rights, 750 units per year. Resales of occupation rights, total sales of occupation rights 7 years previously. Management fees increase by 15% each year. Note, years ending 31 March. Underpinning these sales forecast assumptions might be projections concerning overall market growth based on future growth in the New Zealand and Australian population of people over 75 and the proportion of people over 75 choosing to live in retirement villages, combined with projections about the future market shares Ryman Healthcare might be able to achieve in this market. Maintenance of Ryman Healthcare's significant capacity to develop, own and manage retirement village units. Maintenance of the existing rate of turnover of occupation rights to existing retirement village units of about 7 years. Continued high occupancy levels. There might be a range of other economic and business drivers of Ryman Healthcare's return on net operating assets we might forecast. Based on our judgments about several future economic and business realities of Ryman Healthcare, we could then forecast the key accounting drivers of Ryman Healthcare's return on net operating assets. For example, our forecasts of growth in residential property values will significantly affect Ryman Healthcare's future operating income and profit margin. However, the weaker property market growth in a few years should also provide Ryman Healthcare with the opportunity to purchase sites for future developments on more favourable terms. Also, it may be able to negotiate better terms with various building contractors if the construction industry slows in a few years. These factors should assist Ryman Healthcare to maintain its margins on selling new occupation rights in the face of possibly weaker residential property markets in a few years. We might also forecast that Ryman Healthcare's current asset turnover, ATO of 0.19, will remain at 0.19 times in 2022 and then increase to 0.20 times in 2023 and remain constant at 0.20 times with its sales, that is total income, growing at a similar rate to its net operating assets, NOA. This might lead us to make the forecasts of these accounting drivers as set out in Table 5.3 below. You will note that I have not set out, for example, the forecasts of operating income that would underpin our forecasts of profit margin. However, I am forecasting steadily increasing profit margins over the next 3 years, which would then stabilise in 2024. Table 5.3. Forecast of Ryman Healthcare's accounting drivers of return on net operating assets 2022 to 2026. Profit margin 66.0%, 62.0%, 60%, 62.0%, 62.0%. Asset turnover 0.19, 0.20, 0.20, 0.20, 0.20. From these forecasts, we can make our forecasts of return on net operating assets for the next few years, which are set out in Table 5.4 below. Table 5.4. Forecast of Ryman Healthcare's return on net operating assets. Table 5.4. Forecast of Ryman Healthcare's return on net operating assets 2022 to 2026. Return on net operating assets, which equals profit margin times asset turnover. 12.5%, 12.4%, 12.0%, 12.4%, 12.4%. However, forecasting Ryman Healthcare's return on net operating assets for the next few years will not be enough for us to forecast the firm's economic profit or abnormal operating income for this period. We also need to forecast Ryman Healthcare's future net operating assets for the next few years. Before we do this, we will need to understand more of the past of a firm than simply its return on net operating assets, which we looked at in Chapter 4. First, we will need to consider the past accounting drivers of Ryman Healthcare's net operating assets. 5.2. Accounting drivers of net operating assets. A firm's enterprise economic profit is its return on net operating assets in excess of its cost of capital, weighted average cost of capital, times the amount of net operating assets the firm has invested in its business, earning that level of return on net operating assets. This can be expressed as economic profit equals return on net operating assets little t minus WACC minus 1, or close bracket in brackets, times net operating assets t minus 1. You'll remember that we use the subscripts such as little t or little t minus 1 to refer to the time period. If return on net operating assets exceeds a firm's weighted average cost of capital, the greater the book value of net operating assets, the greater will be a firm's economic profit. We can separate the effect of sales on the change in net operating assets as follows. Asset turnover equals sales to net operating assets, and 1 over asset turnover equals net operating assets divided by sales. Net operating assets equals sales times net operating assets divided by sales, which equals sales times 1 over asset turnover. Thus, delta net operating assets, the change in net operating assets, equals the change in sales times 1 over asset turnover. This expression shows that the change in the book value of a firm's net operating assets is driven by changes in its level of sales and by changes in the amount of net operating assets needed to put in place to generate $1 of sales, that is 1 over asset turnover. Growth in sales will typically be the primary accounting driver of a change in the book value of a firm's net operating assets. This is because growing sales usually requires investment in net operating assets such as additional inventory, property, plant and equipment, and accounts receivable. The amount of investment in net operating assets required to support each dollar of growth in sales will be determined by 1 over asset turnover, that is the inverse of asset turnover, which is the relationship between net operating assets and sales. Typically, the asset turnover of business does not vary greatly over time, unless a firm's business operations have undergone some reasonably substantial restructuring, or if a firm enters an unexpected economic downturn. For most firms, sales growth is usually more important than change in 1 over asset turnover as an accounting driver of change in net operating assets. Good and bad sales growth. Sales growth is a key driver of increasing the book value of net operating assets and increasing economic profit and cash flow and the value of a firm from the point of view of equity investors. But we know our sales force and marketers could generate sales growth by discounting price, offering additional benefits to customers, increasing a firm's product range to increase customer choice and so increase the inventories of a firm and the general complexity and costs of its business, and so on. This could all be great for customers, but I've seen several businesses destroy substantial value for equity investors by uncritically pursuing strategies such as these to grow sales. Clearly, some sales growth will add substantial value to equity investors, while other sales growth will not. Some sales growth will be good, value creating, and other sales growth will be bad, value destroying for equity investors. Yet our formula showing the relationship between change in net operating assets in OA and change in sales seems to imply all sales growth is good for equity investors. After all, if we increase sales, we increase net operating assets, which increases economic profit and value to equity investors. It seems many salespeople and marketers can implicitly or explicitly think this way. However, change or growth in net operating assets depends on the interaction between sales and asset turnover. Growth in sales that keeps asset turnover unchanged will lead to growth in net operating assets. But growth in sales that reduces asset turnover, for example by requiring higher levels of inventory per dollar of sales to support a more diverse product range, or by increasing accounts receivable per dollar of sales to support more generous terms of trade with customers, would also lead to growth in net operating assets. However, is this necessarily a good thing for equity investors? We know that economic profit equals return on net operating assets minus WACC minus 1, or times net operating assets. We also know that profitability, PM, and efficiency, ATO, are key accounting drivers of return on net operating assets. That is, return on net operating assets equals profit margin times asset turnover. Actions to grow sales that reduce asset turnover will increase net operating assets, but will also reduce return on net operating assets, RNOA. Depending on which effect is greater, this type of sales growth may increase or reduce economic profit, and so either add or destroy value to equity investors. Equally, growth in sales that reduces profit margin, for example through reducing prices while keeping costs constant, will also increase net operating assets and reduce return on net operating assets. Again, depending on which effect is greater, this type of sales growth may either add or destroy value to equity investors. I could go on, but enough said. It is critical to be able to distinguish between sales growth that adds value and sales growth which destroys value to equity investors. The economic profit framework provides a conceptual way of thinking about this and can help us to identify good and bad sales growth in a firm. To strengthen your understanding of this important distinction, see the great video, Good and Bad Sales Growth. Individuals, particularly those in sales and marketing, who can deeply understand the interrelationship between sales growth, profit margin, and asset turnover for a firm, are extremely valuable people to have around in any firm. Also, to be able to assess the value of a firm, we need to be able to clearly identify expected future sales growth that adds value to equity investors and that which does not. It is an important part of knowing what adds value. Ryman Healthcare's past growth in book value of net operating assets is set out in Table 5.5 below. As you can see, there's been a strong growth in Ryman Healthcare's net operating assets in this period, increasing by 5.7 times from about 800 million in 2012 to about 4.6 billion in 2021, with impressive growth rates of between about 12% and 29% each year. This strong growth in net operating assets has been a significant contributor to the growth in Ryman Healthcare's economic profit and growth in value to equity holders during this period. The key accounting drivers of Ryman Healthcare's net operating assets during this period are set out in Table 5.6 below. A key driver of the strong growth of net operating assets of Ryman Healthcare has been its strong sales growth, which has grown about 3.4 times from 257.0 million in 2012 to 872.6 million in 2021. This was also supported by a decrease in Ryman Healthcare's asset turnover from 0.3 times in 2012 to 0.19 times in 2021. We can analyse Ryman Healthcare's sales into the following three main types of revenue or income streams: care fees, management fees, fair value movement of investment properties. The previous growth in each of these items is set out in Table 5.7 below. Ryman Healthcare has experienced strong growth in each of these main revenue or income streams. Care fees have grown strongly during this period, increasing 2.8 times from 126.9 million in 2012 to 359.2 million in 2021. It should be noted I expect the profit margin from care fees for running nursing homes and hospital beds to be significantly less than the profit margins from its other activities. Another interesting aspect to Ryman Healthcare's past growth in sales is its growth in management fees. These are a relatively minor part of its total sales, representing about 10 to 15% of sales, and generally have been growing at a similar rate to total sales. It has also demonstrated the most consistent growth of any of Ryman Healthcare's revenue or income streams, growing, except for 2021, by between 12.4% and 20.5% each year. Growth in management fees was only 5.0% in 2021 because of reduced sales of occupancy rights that year due to COVID restrictions. This is a high quality revenue stream as it is predictable and growing strongly. And a major part of Ryman Healthcare's sales is the fair value movement of investment properties. This has increased 4.1 times from 101.9 million in 2012 to 416.8 million in 2021. Its proportion of total sales increased from 40% in 2012 to 47.8% in 2021. You will note that sales and resales of occupation rights to retirement village units are not included in Ryman Healthcare's sales. This is because Ryman Healthcare retains most of the rights and obligations of ownership of the retirement village units, with occupation rights effectively lifelong leases over the retirement village units, given in exchange for interest-free loans. This is important to bear in mind. There are some risks Ryman Healthcare is taking in retaining ownership of a large portfolio of retirement village units. Should demand for retirement village units falter in New Zealand and Australia, Ryman Healthcare might find itself exposed to the risk of losses as it seeks to resell occupation rights in its retirement village units in the future. We've examined the accounting drivers of the strong growth in Ryman Healthcare's net operating assets over 10 years from 2012 to 2021. We've seen the importance of sales growth as one of the drivers of the growth in Ryman Healthcare's net operating assets. Yet we know that these various accounting drivers or numbers are not really driving the performance of Ryman Healthcare, but are themselves merely passengers on the journey. In the next section, we will have a look at one more aspect of a firm's past that we need to consider before predicting the future, namely the economic and business drivers of these accounting drivers of Ryman Healthcare, the real drivers of net operating assets.